Okay, we are continuing along with the First Punic War. Now, in the last video, we talked about those Roman naval victories off the coast of Sicily, and also some of that back and forth fighting that was going on in Sicily itself. And so we ended the last video with that Carthaginian attack into Syracuse territory at Camarina. The Romans, of course, were able to repulse this offensive and drive the Carthaginians not only out of Camarina, but also out of Enna. And then the Romans launched their own counterattack and succeeded in capturing Misistradon. And so as you can see on this map to the right, the Romans were beginning to carve Sicily right in half, and were about to make this their own private island. But then the Romans suffered a minor setback. In the north, they launched an attack against Panormus, but it was repulsed, and the Romans were forced to retreat out of Carthaginian territory. In 257 BC, the Romans won a minor naval victory at Tyndareus. 7 years into the war, the Romans now believed that the war could best be won by launching an all-out invasion of Africa, so Sicily could wait, and so all of the war resources would be directed towards inflicting severe economic damage on Carthaginian cities in Africa. The Romans built a new fleet for this task and set sail for Africa, but the Carthaginians caught wind of this invasion and decided to confront the Romans at sea. And so this set up one of the largest sea battles in naval history. And that was the Battle of Ignomus in 256 BC. And as I mentioned, this was the largest naval battle the ancient world had ever seen. The Roman fleet numbered at 330 ships with 140,000 sailors. The Carthaginians countered with 350 ships with 150,000 sailors. Now, both Roman consuls took command of the fleet. The first squadron was commanded by Marcus Regulus, and the second Roman squadron was commanded by Consul Lucius Vaso. Now, as you can see here, the Roman squadrons formed up into a wedge formation, and this would give maximum priority to their latest weapon, the corvus, which we talked about in the last video. So the first and the second squadron were right here, and the third squadron commanded the rear. There was a supply squadron in the middle that contained horses. Now, the Carthaginians formed up into 4 squadrons. Hanno commanded the squadron on the far right, and the second and third squadrons were commanded by Hamilcar. Now, this is not Hamilcar Barca, this is another Hamilcar, but we will be talking about Hamilcar Barca in a few videos. Now, the Carthaginian strategy was to avoid the corvus at all costs, and so they wanted to avoid a frontal assault, and that would make the corvus essentially useless. And so Hamilcar was to feign a retreat, hoping to lure the first and second squadrons away from the transport squadron, and that would allow the 2 Carthaginian squadrons on the flanks to attack the 2 squadrons in the rear from the side. And so the battle began, and Hamilcar began the action by faking a retreat with the 2 consular squadrons in pursuit. And so everything was going according to plan in the initial phase. Once the 2 leading squadrons had been led away, the Carthaginian 3rd and 4th squadrons were able to launch their assaults. And the first squadron was able to attack the supply squadron and drive it towards the Sicilian coast. The 4th squadron was able to attack the Roman 3rd squadron in the rear. And so things initially looked good for the Carthaginians. But then disaster struck. Hamilcar's center formations lost their battle against the Roman 1st and 2nd squadrons, and that allowed the 1st and 2nd to wheel around and attack the Carthaginian 1st and 4th squadrons from the rear, and it turned into an utter disaster for the Carthaginians. The Carthaginian fleet was utterly destroyed, and in the process the Carthaginians lost 95 ships, while the Romans suffered only 24 ships lost. But worst of all, tens of thousands of Carthaginian sailors were taken prisoner or killed, and so it was a decisive turning point in the First Punic War, and it allowed the Romans to proceed with their planned attack on Africa, and now the Carthaginians were powerless to stop it. And so in 256 BC, the Roman army under the consuls Lucius and Marcus Regulus invaded the Carthaginian homeland in Africa. Once they formed up on the coast of Africa, they headed to the city of Aspis, where they dug a trench to begin the siege of the city. The Romans were able to take Aspis relatively quickly, and they installed a garrison to guard the city from any future Carthaginian attacks. And so the Romans had gained a foothold in Africa. The Roman consul sent word to Rome of what had transpired and asked for instructions on what to do next. While the Roman consuls awaited word from Rome, they took 20,000 prisoners and loaded them up on transport ships. Instructions finally arrived back from Rome with orders that Regulus would remain in Africa, with the other Roman consul returning to Rome. Now, Polybius will tell us that Regulus stayed behind with 15,000 soldiers and 500 cavalry. He also kept 40 ships in reserve, so the bulk of the Roman fleet headed back to Sicily and Italy. With the Romans at Aspis, the Carthaginians ordered some forces back from Sicily to reinforce their existing armies in Africa, and they ordered 3 generals to take charge of the Carthaginian army. After he was able to organize the defenses at Aspis, Regulus started to drive deeper into Carthaginian territory. Town after town after town fell to the Romans until they reached the city of Adis. And here Regulus completely encircled the town and began to prepare for a siege. The Carthaginians decided to make a stand at Adis, and so an army was dispatched from Carthage itself. Now the Carthaginians set up on a ridge which gave them an excellent view of the Romans. Although the Carthaginians were at a severe disadvantage in terms of their infantry units, they had a huge advantage with their cavalry and especially those war elephants. But the terrain was steep and rocky, and this sort of neutralized the ability for the Carthaginian elephants and cavalry to maneuver. And the Roman commanders recognized this and took the initiative and launched an attack towards the top of the ridge. As I mentioned before, the Carthaginians were not able to use their cavalry, but they decided to meet the Roman legions head on, and they actually were able to defeat the first Roman legion and drive it back in disarray. But the other Roman legions were able to attack from the side of the ridge and were able to surround the advancing Carthaginians. A general rout ensued, and the Romans drove the Carthaginians off the battlefield and back to their camps. The Carthaginians eventually retreated from the area altogether, and that allowed the Romans to take Adis. After this victory, the Romans plundered several towns, and the Carthaginians were unable to stop them at this point. Now, shortly after this battle, Regulus offered peace terms to Carthage, but they were extremely harsh, and so the Carthaginians rejected them out of hand, and the war continued on. After this, the Romans were able to capture Tunis, and this put Carthage in mortal danger. With the situation in dire straits, the Carthaginians decided to look for outside help, and they hired a Spartan general named Xanthippus. And Xanthippus was able to whip the Carthaginian army into shape. And I guess if you need your army reorganized, who better to do that than a Spartan general? Now, Xanthippus not only retrained the Carthaginian army, he was also commissioned as a general. And so he would be the main tactician in the coming battle with the Romans. And so Xanthippus decided to take control of the situation and march towards the Romans at Tunis. And he took with them 12,000 soldiers and 4,000 cavalrymen, and according to Polybius, just under 100 elephants. The Romans countered with 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. The Romans set up in their normal formation with the legion infantry in the center and the cavalry on the flanks. But the Romans had a problem. Their cavalry was outnumbered by the Carthaginians by at least 4-1 and perhaps as high as 8-1. So the Carthaginians started the battle with an attack by their elephants, and this tied up the Roman infantry. The severely outnumbered Roman cavalry was quickly annihilated, and with that, the Carthaginian cavalry was able to charge from both sides, and this destroyed the cohesion of the Roman center, which was already occupied with the Carthaginian elephants. Only 2,000 Roman troops escaped the battle to be rescued by the Roman fleet. And with that, the Romans were forced to withdraw from Africa, and with that, the rest of the war was fought in Sicily and at sea. The Romans constructed a new fleet to rescue survivors off the coast of Africa, and the expedition was highly successful, but off the coast of Sicily, the fleet encountered a massive storm, and almost all of the fleet was wiped out, and the Romans perhaps suffered as many as 90,000 casualties. Imagine that, 90,000. With the victory in Africa and the latest Roman fleet destroyed by that storm, the Carthaginians decided to launch an attack down the southern coast of Sicily, and they pushed all the way to the key city of Agrigentum. The Carthaginians, however, decided to burn Agrigentum to the ground because they lacked sufficient strength to hold the city. Now, a word on Regulus. Regulus was taken prisoner by the Carthaginians after the setback in Africa, but he was allowed to return to Rome to try to secure a peace treaty, with the condition that he return to Carthage if the negotiations failed. But when Regulus arrived in Rome, he convinced the Roman Senate not to accept a peace treaty and to continue on with the war. Now imagine that. If he was able to secure a treaty, he would have gained his freedom. But talk about loyalty and honor. He knew the right thing to do was to convince his fellow Roman senators to continue on with the war. And so the Roman Senate heeded his advice. Regulus, however, decided to fulfill his oath to the Carthaginians and return to Carthage. Rome, however, tried to talk him out of it, but he decided to keep his word and return to Carthage, where reportedly he was tortured to death. So I find that quite amazing. Imagine a politician or general doing something like that today. I doubt it, but who knows? In any event, despite the huge setbacks on land and at sea, the Romans regrouped and launched a counteroffensive in 253 BC, and we will get to that in the next video.